Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the final program in this year's Albany Public Library and Adirondack Experience collaborative Zoom series, True Crime of the Adirondacks. I'm Rebecca Lubin. I'm head of community engagement for Albany Public Library. I would like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Albany Public Library is situated on the land of the Mohawk, Hodnen Aswani and the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohegans. The Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in our two regions and practice their teachings and lifeways. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome New York Times bestselling author Jennifer Donnelly. Jennifer writes for children, teens, and adults, and her work has garnered many awards, including a Carnegie Medal, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, a Michael L. Printz Honor, a Green Earth Book Award, and an Indies Choice Best Young Adult Book Award. Her works have been optioned for miniseries and feature films. Jennifer's novel, A Northern Light, retells the sensational true story of the 1906 murder of Grace Brown, a murder that took place on Big Moose Lake near Old Forge. The novel was recognized as one of the top 10 best young adult books released in 2003. Throughout the evening, please feel free to submit any question using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Jennifer will answer your questions after the presentation is over. And now, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to speak this evening. And I'd love to say a huge heartfelt thank you to all the attendees who are zooming in and joining us tonight. I am such a huge fan of the Adirondack Experience, the museum at Blue Mountain Lake, where I did so much of my research for this book. And I'm also a huge cheerleader of public libraries throughout the country and have been ever since my grandmother first took me to one when I was 4 years old. That day opened worlds for me, and libraries still open worlds for me to this day. So a huge thank you to both of these extraordinary institutions for preserving our precious Adirondack history and for making it available to all of us. So tonight I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about my novel, A Northern Light, how I wrote it, why I wrote it, and afterwards we'll do questions. I'm happy to answer your questions on the book, on Grace Brown, and also on writing, because I know in many of these gatherings, we always have some aspiring writers in there. So if you want to ask questions on writing, publishing, editors, agents, that whole world, I'm here for you. So now about the book. I'm always happy to talk about my work because it means I get to talk about my two favorite topics, fiction and history. But honestly, I always get a little nervous too, because my writing process is very personal, a little bit weird, and according to my husband, maybe a little bit insane too. And it's kind of scary to share your own personal insanity with a room full of people you've only just met. But for me, that's what writing historical fiction is. It's this obsession with the past, this overwhelming compulsion to go back in time and try to redo those mistakes and crimes of history, try to make them right, if only on paper. For this big, overwhelming obsession of mine, as for many other things in my life, I blame my mother. And now I'm going to share my screen with you. Hold on one second.
Stop sharing.
Stop sharing? Okay, hold on one second.
Sure.
Share. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, we've got it, I think.
You're gone.
Sorry for that pause there. As I was saying, for this huge historical obsession with the past, I blame my mom. Here's my mom. This is Wilfreda Donnelly. She was my first storyteller. She was the one who tucked me in every night and told me my bedtime stories, which sounds really nice, doesn't it? That's because you don't know my mom. My mom is this freewheeling, no holds barred kind of storyteller who saw no need to borrow from amateurs like Mother Goose or Walt Disney. She had her own material, thank you, and she felt it was far more valuable than any lessons Mickey Mouse and his colleagues might have to offer. My mom is German, and she was a child during World War II. She grew up in Bremen, which is a northern port town that was heavily bombed during the war. So she had this very hard, war-torn life, a life that was full of stories, and she liked to tell them. And I think now maybe she needed to tell them. So while all my little friends were settling down for the night with stories like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, I was getting this first-person narrative of life in Hitler's Germany. One night, my mom might tell me what it felt like to be 8 years old and running for her life to the air raid shelter, only to come out a few hours later and find out that her house and everything in it had burned to the ground. Or she might tell me a story about Herbert, this kid who was the neighborhood snot nose, this boy who had joined the Hitler Youth. And he put on his uniform every time he got into trouble, because when he had it on, he was the property of the state, and no one, not even his parents, could touch him. Or she might tell me about her friend Harold, who was a little boy who had cerebral palsy, and how his mother had to hide him in a closet every time the Nazi health inspectors came to town to keep him from being taken away. Now, some might say these stories of a war-torn childhood were not suitable for a young child, and I have to admit, a few of them were pretty harrowing. I guess I should have been horrified and terrified and unable to sleep after hearing them, but I wasn't. I was fascinated, and I would sit up in my bed and ask my mother a million questions. How, Mom? Why, Mom? How did you feel about this? What did you do? My mother's stories taught me something so important. They taught me that history isn't only about generals and kings and battles and treaties. It's about us, the everyday ordinary people, and how these enormous forces of our world work on us, how they shape us and define us, sometimes save us, sometimes doom us. My mom's stories made history very real for me, and I see now that they made both a novelist and a historian out of me. Ever since I was small, I've been the kind of person who can't walk by an old house like this one without stopping to wonder about all the lives it contained. What happened to them? What happened to this house's people? What went wrong? What made them walk away? I can't pick up an old quilt without thinking about the women who made it and the lives they lived and all the joys and sorrows bound up in every stitch. I can't look at photos of people from the past without asking them, who were you? What did you hope for out of your life? What were your dreams? This obsession with the past is why I write. And what I'd like to do now is tell you a bit about how I write, to give you a glimpse of all the things that went into the making of A Northern Light. Several things inspired me to write the book, and the first was stories my family told me as I was growing up. Although I didn't write A Northern Light until I was in my 30s, the seeds for the book were planted when I was a kid. I spent a lot of my childhood in a small town called Port Leyden, which is on the western edge of the Adirondack Park. This is Port Leyden in Lewis County. This shot is about 100 years old, but that doesn't matter. The place has not changed a bit. So many members of my dad's extended family worked in and around the Adirondacks, and they all descended from Irish immigrants, so they love to talk. I grew up hearing stories, lots of stories about lives lived in the mountains. I heard stories about bootleggers hot-footing it downstate from Canada, and a man dying in a blizzard, only 10 feet from his home. I heard about a great aunt slowly losing her mind on my family's very remote farmstead on the Tug Hill Plateau. When I was a child, I could not wait for the meals to be over at family gatherings and the storytelling to begin. Because there, with 3 generations of us seated around the table, I learned firsthand what immense power words have. Years before I would know or care about things like narrative drive or pacing or suspense, I saw them in action. And I saw how master storytellers use them to hold their listeners and to make us laugh and gasp. And I learned to listen to the pauses and the hitches and the empty places between those words, hearing in those silences what it meant to be hungry, or to birth children miles away from any doctor, or to be hired out to work for strangers at the age of 12. Watching a gray head bowed with the weight of remembering, I saw that words could tell more than a story. They could tell a life. Now, one of the stories I heard at these gatherings was about this drowning that occurred on Big Moose Lake in the Glenmore Hotel in 1906. It was told by my grandmother, who actually waitressed at the Waldheim, which was a great camp on Big Moose close to the Glenmore. And it concerned this young woman who had been killed in South Bay. This is a shot of Big Moose taken from Punky Bay, looking towards South Bay around 1906. This shot is actually a time machine that takes me back to the lake as it would have looked to Grace. The stillness is there, the eeriness, the remoteness. Part of Big Moose still looks like this, but a lot of parts of it don't. So this young woman who'd been killed in South Bay, she was only 19 years old, and it was her boyfriend who'd killed her. He'd brought her to the Glenmore, he'd taken her out in a boat, and he'd drowned her. Now, there was no talk of motives around us kids, nothing. It was sort of about unplanned pregnancies or anything like that. That was kind of improper, but there didn't need to be. A creepy lake and a dead body were good enough for us. It was this great ghost story. And for a long time, that's all it really was for me until I was older and started to read more about this murder case. I read Theodore Dreiser's magnificent novel, An American Tragedy, which was based on the murder. I read a nonfiction account too of the case. It was called Murder in the Adirondacks by Craig Brandon. And what I discovered in the pages of those books blew me away. I discovered that there was so much more to that ghost story. There was so much to think about. There was Dreiser's idea of a dark side to the American dream. There were issues of upward social mobility at any cost, and social issues, class issues, women's issues. But more than all of this stuff, there was a girl at the center of this story, a girl that I started to get to know through Dreiser's words and through Brandon's words, but most of all, through her own words. And this girl was Grace Brown. Grace was a farm girl who left her home in South Otselic, New York, to work in the Gillette skirt factory in Cortland, New York. And there she met a young man named Chester Gillette, who was a nephew of the factory's owner. And here's Chester. So a romance blossomed between Chester and Grace eventually found herself pregnant. Now, in 1906, if you were a young woman, unmarried and pregnant, you were in a lot of trouble. So poor Grace was desperate. She wanted Chester to marry her, but Chester had other ideas. If we believe the prosecution's case against him, he kind of wanted to trade up. He wanted to go with a girl from a very prominent, socially prominent Cortland family. So feeling ill in the first stages of pregnancy, very worried, very scared, Grace left her job and she returned home to her family's farm. And from there, she wrote letters to Chester Gillette, begging him to do the right thing. These letters, Grace's own words, were the strongest inspiration for A Northern Light. Here's a picture of Grace's last letter. These letters, all her letters, exist. They exist to this day in the archives collection of Hamilton College in upstate New York. They were all found in a drawer in Gillette's desk after the murder and used as evidence against him. I don't know why he didn't think of disposing them. I guess he was not much of a criminal mastermind. These letters were actually read out in court, and my experience of seeing them and going to Hamilton College and actually holding them was overwhelming, because it's not every day that you get to hear from a murder victim after she's murdered. In these letters, you get to know her, not just as a victim, which is so important, but as this lively, smart, funny 19-year-old girl just beginning her life, who had family she loved and friends who liked to pick strawberries and go horse riding and shoot off firecrackers and was learning how to cook. This just lovely young woman. And as she's writing these letters, these initial letters to Chester, she's trying to stay very upbeat, trying to, I think, remain attractive to him, not be too much of a nag, not let too much of her worry and desperation come out. But as the letters progress, that effort starts to feel very worn and very threadbare. And then we come to the last letter, which is the one you see here. In this letter, she and Chester, at this point, they've made plans. She's convinced him to take her away. They're going to meet in the Adirondacks. They're going to go somewhere together. She's probably hoping he's going to marry her, or she has been all along, or perhaps, we don't know, maybe take her to a home for unwed mothers where she can have the baby. But in this letter, the strangest thing happens because she's talking to Chester, she's writing to him, but there's the eeriest sense that she's really talking to herself as you read this letter. What I get from this letter is that she has a very strong sense at this point that things are not going to go well. And in it, she's saying goodbye, this very chilling final goodbye to friends, to neighbors, familiar places. And then she talks about her mother. Here's a snippet of it. I'll read it to you, if I can. I know I shall never see any of them again. And Mama, good heavens, how I do love Mama. I don't know what I shall do without her. Sometimes I think if I could tell Mama, but I can't. She has trouble enough as it is, and I couldn't break her heart like that. If I come back dead, perhaps if she does not know, she won't be angry with me. So you see, I can't get through this still. 20 odd years after I've written the book, I can't read this letter dry-eyed. Grace's family was actually in the courthouse for Gillette's trial. As I mentioned, these letters were read. So her mother, her father, they would have sat there. They would have heard these words, and I cannot even imagine their grief. So in these words, in Grace's words, I could hear her voice, and I was deeply affected by it. So much so, as you can tell, that I actually grieved for her. I could not get her or her words out of my mind, and she began to haunt me in a way. So here is the thing about ghosts. They are very beguiling creatures, but they're dangerous creatures too. They will sit in a room with you and they will give you their stories, but they take pieces of your heart in return. My feelings about Grace and about what had happened to her were so strong and so overwhelming. I had to find a way to deal with them. And I did that the way writers do, by writing a story. I felt I had to rewrite history, as I told you earlier, if only a little bit. I had to have something good come out of Grace's death, and that something good was my main character, Mattie Goki. In my mind, as I thought about what my story might be, I saw Grace standing on the porch of the Glenmore all alone. She was hot, she was worried, she was tired, and I saw her sit down and pick at the hem of her skirt. I knew she was scared and homesick, and I could not bear that. I had to know that some good person saw her and smiled at her before she died and showed her a kindness. And that person was Mattie Goki. In my mind, another girl appeared on the porch. At that moment, she was carrying this tray, and on it was a glass of lemonade. She gave the drink to Grace, and she didn't charge her because it was a hot day and poor Grace didn't look well. And as Mattie was about to go, Grace suddenly impulsively fished this bundle of letters out of her bag tied with a ribbon, and she handed them to Mattie and asked her to burn them. This was only one short, small scene, but as soon as I had it, I knew I had my story. As soon as I saw these two women together on the porch, and I knew this because my heart was beating hard and my hands were shaking. And I had this feeling of what I can only describe as this hyper reality, very alive. It's this incredible, awesome feeling. And I always know that I'm in for a really wild ride when it strikes. Characters appear and they take up residence in my head and heart, and they stay there sometimes for years. So this character of Mattie came to me pretty quickly. And with her, the beginning of my story, I knew who she was and what she wanted. And I knew that meeting Grace would force her to make a very hard decision about her life. The arc of her story and Grace's story, they came together for me pretty quickly. But what took a lot more time was getting Grace's and Mattie's world right. And to do that, I had to research extensively. So A Northern Light is, of course, historical fiction, and I had to wear two hats when I wrote it, the novelists and the historians. Grace's and Mattie's difficulties are due in large part to the social constraints placed upon women in early 20th century America. So both of my characters had to be very grounded in their time. As a historian, my job is very much to make the bygone world of Big Moose Lake come 100% alive and believable, so that I can then come in as a novelist and start taking a few liberties with it. So when it comes to historical research, I take a two-part approach. The first part is a rigorous and thorough pursuit of the facts. It's really important to me to be accurate in my description of a past world. So I spend a lot of time on research, and I work from as many primary sources as I can. So as I mentioned, for Northern Light, I spent hours at the Adirondack Experience in Blue Mountain Lake. I studied the public exhibitions there, learning everything from how roads were made in 1906 to what tools river drivers used. I visited the museum's private library as well, their archives, where I was able to hold a strand of Grace Brown's hair, read the court transcripts from Chester Gillette's murder trial, read the actual preserved diary of a Cranberry Lake farm wife who lived 100 years ago. I was able to handle a lot of ephemera from the great camps. There is a ton of detective work on a book like this, especially when I was writing it about 20 years ago now. I couldn't then just Google, for example, how much did the Glenmore Hotel charge guests in 1906? The history is just too specialized. Info like that has to come from a primary source. So something like this is super helpful. I found this in the museum's archives, and it was amazing to me. It's just this little scrap of stationery from the Glenmore, only about maybe 2 inches by 6 inches in size, yet it's a gold mine. It tells us so much. Just take a quick look at it. It's telling you, if you look down at the bottom right corner, 190, so you know you're in the first decade of the 1900s. Great, that's what I'm writing. I'm writing in 1906. This most likely applies to my time. I can immediately know the name of the proprietor at that time. I know what the rates are. And $2 or $3 per day is a significant amount for Americans at that time. I know that here in this hotel in Big Moose Lake, which was in the middle of nowhere in 1906, we have long distance telephones. We have steam heat, we have electricity. This is pretty amazing. This is telling me that this is an upper crusty kind of hotel. It's not you're just kind of flop around, camping sort of experience. People are going to pay money for this. They're going to be well dressed. They're going to have certain expectations. And if I couldn't, get that on my own, they're going to tell it to us ourselves, where it says new and strictly first class. So that was hugely, hugely helpful. I also looked at dozens of postcards from the time, things that tourists would have bought and sent back home to friends and family. These things are tiny time machines. This is the Glenmore in 1904. This was 2 years before Grace was murdered. The place is gone now. It burned down in 1954, I believe. So this view gives me what my main character, Mattie, would have seen every day while she was working at the Glenmore. And it also shows me where Grace's body would have been brought ashore. These things are invaluable. Here's another one of an Adirondack guide carrying a boat. These postcards take you back to the people, not just the places, but the people who are gone as well. And they show you how they looked, what they wore, what they did for work, and what that work did to them. People in these old photos, like this guy, they tend to be pretty lean, which reminds you that food was not plentiful for everyone in the Adirondacks in 1906. For many people, hunger was a constant threat. So existence for Mattie's family, a farm family eking out a living, would always have been very precarious. This shot is of Lonesome Pine. And these old postcards are also fantastic for seeing the immense Adirondacks wilderness as it was, for getting a sense again of the remoteness of the lakes in 1906, the scarcity of houses and stores, the complete absence of neon and plastic cars. These postcards convey to us again the stillness and the eeriness of the place 100 years ago, and looking at them, I think you can see why Chester Gillette might have thought the Adirondacks were a very good place to get rid of Grace without being seen doing it. Excuse me. I also spent time at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York. They keep early breeds of livestock there, so I was able to see how pigs and cows were kept before factory farming. I was able to watch a blacksmith at work and learn that his counterpart in 1906 would not have hand forged a shoe for a horse or a mule, but actually would have taken a shoe from a barrel shipped up from a foundry and fitted that shoe onto the animal. Now, this is a really small and important nerdy detail, but it places us accurately and firmly in upstate New York in 1906 and not in just some vague, amorphous past. I visited the Old Forge Historical Association and I read newspapers, census records, tax records. I even prowled eBay for material. eBay can actually be a very good source of primary material. And I found these pages that someone had taken from a book or a magazine. This page was super exciting to me. It provided interior shots of the Glenmore that I had not been able to find anywhere else. And it tells us again so much. It confirms the info and impressions that we gleaned from that little slip of stationery. If you look at it, you can see, the beautiful diagonal oak paneling. You can see the gas lights hanging down that slip of stationery mentioned. We have pressed back oak rockers. We have beautiful carpeting on the floor, a piano in the background. In the lower right-hand side, white linens, nice silverware, nice cutlery. In the way back, I can see the doors, the in and out doors to the kitchen that my characters, Mattie and Weaver, would have come and gone through as they were serving the guests. So again, it's confirming this idea of the Glenmore as an upper crusty sort of place. I also spent a ton of time in the area itself. This is a shot of the Waldheim on Big Moose, which is one of the last of the original gray camps. This was very close to the Glenmore camp, and this is where my grandmother waitressed. And this is how the main house looked when it was first built and how it still looks today, because this beautiful camp still exists. I asked my grandmother for her recollection of her waitressing days there to help me construct what Mattie's daily life would have been like. I stayed at this camp. I walked along the lakeshore at different hours, noting how the light changes. I listened to the loons at night. I drove the distances in my car that Pa and Royal Loomis would have driven, measuring the mileage, noting the terrain, making sure a mule or a horse could make those runs. So in short, I collected a lot of information, a lot of facts, times, dates, names, places, but facts by themselves do not make for good reading. And one thing I did not want to do in this book was to embalm history. I wanted it to live and to breathe and to become a character all on its own. So to do that, I used the second part of my approach to historical research. An airy-fairy, touchy-feely, intuitive pursuit of everything but the facts. So when I'm gathering facts, I look at old photos, as we just did together, to see how an interior looked. There we go. To see how an interior looked, or to get an idea of how people dressed. But I'm looking at these photos for more than that, for the intangibles, for things like personality, attitude, emotion. I need to know the souls of the people I'm writing about in order to get them down on paper. Like this woman. Isn't she wonderful? I love her so much. She's so spirited and proud of her beautiful horse. And she looks like she's a lot of fun. I would love to have known her. Or this man, who is obviously so fond of his chickens. These two people came from an album of snapshots taken in upstate New York that I also bought from eBay. I love these photos because they very much contradict the stiff, proper, formal turn of the century images that we're so used to seeing of our great grandparents. When you look at photos like these, they're relaxed, they're candid, and looking at them, you know that these people, you just know that they laughed and they danced and they sang and they fooled and they joked just like we do. This is an old autograph book that my mom dug up at Back of the Barn, which is a great antique store in Remsen, New York. It belonged to a little girl named Evelyn, and I used two of the inscriptions in it for a northern light. This is one of them. Never make love in the country because potatoes have eyes and corn have ears. One of Mattie's friends teases her about her beau royal with just those words. Now, if you're sharp-eyed, you'll notice that the little book is from the 1930s, not 1906. I think there's a date there of 34. But I was comfortable using it still because these little ditties and songs and rhymes often spring up well before a dated use of them occurs. They endure for decades in some cases, and I could very much see Mattie and her friends still using them. I found this notebook at an antique show. It belonged to a boy named Custer Long. Here's a page from inside the notebook. The careful handwriting that you can see and the A stamped on the page tell us that Custer is this studious, earnest kid. I could see him in a classroom laboring over his notes, just as Mattie and Weaver would have done. I especially like Custer's last page, titled A Few Practical Don'ts. I like his first point very much. Don't think that breaking up the soil for an inch is plowing. I try to remember that advice when I'm researching, to not be satisfied with the superficial and always go deeper. I have to admit, though, I'm still trying to find the life lesson in point number 2, don't begrudge manure. So the tax records, the diaries, the old farm catalogs, these things are all crucial to remaking my bygone world, but it's this stuff. It's the photos of the woman with her horse and the man with his chickens and Custer's notes that really allow me to reach back and clasp hands with people from the past. History, facts, research, they're all crucial. They're all important, but they're nothing by themselves, not to a novel. They have to serve to animate the characters, to help the readers know them and love them and feel for them. Otherwise, all the work I've just described to you has been for nothing. And that's the ultimate test for me, really. Is the emotion there? Because if it's not, then as a novelist, I failed. Because of all the things I put into Northern Light, heart is what matters to me the most, more than anything, more than educating or entertaining my readers. I want to make them feel when they read a Northern Light. I want to make them feel Mattie's love of books and her fragile dream of becoming a writer. And I want them to feel Grace Brown's desperation, her despair, and the injustice of what happened to her. As I told you, Grace haunted me when I was writing the book, and she haunts me to this day. She was killed for one reason and one reason only, because she was pregnant. And as I wrote A Northern Light, I tried to comfort myself with the idea that things are very different now than they were in 1906, that they're better, and that young women who find themselves with an unwanted pregnancy have many options that Grace Brown didn't have. But that comforting notion was challenged as I was writing the book by several other ghosts. One of these ghosts was a woman named Christine Kupka. And around the time that I was writing the book, she went missing too. I think I have a slide of her. She's up there on the left. She too was unmarried and pregnant. She was never found, and her family always suspected that the father of her child killed her. For many years, when I lived in Brooklyn, Christine's face stared down at me from a giant missing poster on the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. And soon after the book was published, another horrible case made the headlines. You may remember it. A man named Scott Peterson killed his pregnant wife, Lacey. Shortly after that story, a basketball star murdered his pregnant girlfriend, and on until I felt to me like these stories were everywhere, like the ghosts were everywhere, and I had been so foolish not to see them. I've written a few more novels since The Northern Light was published, and many of them were inspired by ghosts too. And as I've gotten older, I've learned that these restless creatures come for a reason. They want to be heard. They want to remind us that they might be dead and gone, but that the injustices they suffered are not. I think what the ghosts want most of all, though, is for us not to rest easy. They want us to remember, to keep trying to make things better, to keep telling their stories in the hopes that one day we'll come up with a better ending. Thank you all so much for listening. I think we have time now for questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. So we do have a question in the Q&A, and everybody keep digest all the wonderful information that Jennifer just shared with us and put some questions in the Q&A. So you have written in many genres. How do you decide what to do next, and when will you do another historical?
Let's see. It's not really my decision. It's sort of I don't know, the story wanting to be told. I feel like excuse me. I feel like the story picks me. Grace's story very much picked me. There was no way I could avoid writing that story. Another book, Revolution of mine, was set in Paris during the Revolution and also in Brooklyn. That story about the young lost king of France also picked me, and I felt I had to give him a voice and his story a voice. So I feel almost as if I'm the channel through which these stories come to life, get written down on the page, and that's all kind of a long waffly way of saying it's kind of not up to me. It's up to the story to pick me. I am currently another historical is percolating inside me. It's going to take a few years to get it out. I'm working on middle grade right now, and I'm working on another rose petal story, which are a little continuations of my Big Tea Rose series. But the characters are coming. They're starting to sit down in my head. They're starting to talk. We're starting to have a back and forth, and they're kind of daring me to get to know them.
That's great. I love that idea of how it just comes, the story finds you, and you're propelled to do these, to then write them. Are the photos you shared in the book?
No, they are not in the book. The book is a novel. It's not nonfiction, but many of these photos are available online. I think you can find a lot of them in Craig Brandon's book, Murder in the Adirondacks. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are up in the Adirondack Experience as well, and on my website.
Great. I loved the photos, by the way. They were great.
Thank
They
you.
really added to what you were the information you were giving. Are any of Grace Brown's letters available to the public to see and to hold as well?
You have to make an appointment, as a researcher with the archives at Hamilton College. I've done this. I did this so long ago that I'm not sure who's in charge anymore, but you can Google that and you can Google Hamilton College. They are excerpted in Craig Brandon's book as well.
Thank you. How did you authenticate the photos of the hotel that you bought on eBay?
How did I authenticate it? It's from an old book. It's printed. It just felt very old. I can't imagine for a reason why anybody would want to say, oh, these are photos of the Glenmore when they're not. And they're not actual photos. They're reprinted from books or magazines from the time. I also, I've seen enough of the Glenmore sort of from the outside to kind of understand that this was reality. It didn't occur to me to question it, quite frankly.
You had enough of clues that
Yeah,
it came
exactly.
to you.
They
Um,
also are, when you get them in your hands, these things are books, old vintage booksellers will know the words when they're all speckled. Is that foxed? When they smell a little bit and they have all those kind of moldy spots on them and things like that. So if it
mhm,
was a forgery, it would have been a very good one.
you would, yeah. Um, were there real inspirations for Mattie and Weaver?
Mattie, yes, I think probably, especially for Mattie, probably an amalgamation, a little bit of myself, my relatives who lived and worked in that area, friends who I had growing up as well. And Weaver, he came from the Adirondack Experience, from the museum. As I was walking around doing research for my book, I think it was at that time an exhibition on transportation and inns of the whole Adirondacks region. And it might have been Speculator. They showed some early, maybe around the turn of the century, inns and roads and streets through the town. And they had an inn with 2 stories and a big balcony. And standing on the balcony was a young Black man, all alone, sort of above it all, by himself, remote from what was going on, down below, and the whole life of the town and the hustle and bustle. And it really struck me. It kind of made a sadness in me, and I started wondering about who this character was. Why was he alone? Why he was up there? Why was he not down in the middle of everybody else? And I think that's what Weaver grew out of, that image.
Nice. I think you mentioned this, but was Grace's killer ultimately prosecuted?
Yes, he was, and he went to the electric chair.
Wow.
And this was based, there were no eyewitnesses. Someone claimed they heard a scream. And then of course, Grace's body was pulled from the water and there were signs of violence on her face. You could argue that that came from the hook, the grappling hook that searchers used to pull her up. Other people argued it came because he hit her with a tennis racket or some other object. So, given the letters, given she was pregnant, given everything that went on, given how he hid his actual name, he used false names. They came up, they stayed in Utica, then they stayed in the Adirondacks. Everywhere they went, he had an assumed name. And as soon as the deed was done, he went to another great camp and had himself a time. So, he wasn't, as I said earlier, he was hardly a criminal mastermind, and he left too many traces. And I can see why they evicted him the way they did. But he was, I believe, in Auburn prison, and he went to the electric chair there.
Do you end up feeling a sense of ownership to advocate for a historical place or person after so much time is spent learning about them?
I don't know if ownership is what I feel. I just feel this, I guess, connection and love and grief and sadness. Why was this lovely? Well, I know why, but sadness over this 19-year-old beautiful woman with everything to live for, everything in front of her, gone. So I feel connected to her, but I certainly don't feel I own her. No.
Can you talk about the sequence of events that Chester Gillette attempted to make the court believe?
Oh, I did this research 20 years ago. So I think if I
Mhm.
talk about the sequence of events, I'm going to get them out of sequence and get myself into trouble. I would advise you guys go to Craig Brandon's book. He goes through it more detail that I could summon right now. And again, he was obviously a major player in this, but my book is about Grace and Mattie. And I've been asked before, why not Chester? Why isn't he in there? Why didn't you write about him? I'm not interested in Chester. He, again, he was a major player. He was the murderer, but I'm interested in Grace.
You wanted to tell her story.
I wanted to tell her story.
Nice. Do you know why Hamilton College was picked to hold her letters?
I do not. It's probably there on their website.
Okay.
I would imagine, this is just imagining that a family member perhaps willed them. I don't know that though.
Oh, this is very nice. How and all the questions are nice, but this is great. How does it feel to have written a book whose impact has lasted over 20 years? I even included a section on A Northern Light in my undergraduate thesis about the history of female protagonists in young adult.
I am so touched and very honored to hear that. Thank you. And it feels wonderful. To know that this story resonates with readers still and influences and inspires young readers still is the very best gift a writer could ever get. It means the world.
So, do you think there's another book for Mattie? This question is, will we ever get to hear the next chapter of Mattie's life?
That depends on if Mattie ever tells it to me. The problem is Mattie left me standing, she on that train platform, she left me too, waving goodbye. And it's up to her whether she ever comes back and speaks to me again. If she does, I will certainly be there to listen.
How did you come up with names like Loomis and Goki?
Their names I heard growing up. The Loomises, were neighbors. Royal was another name that I heard growing up. Goki is, kind of I guess, an Englishization of Gautier and the French Canadian name, Gauthier. So these were around, these were percolating. I grew up partly in Lewis County. I spent part of my childhood there, which is quite close to Canada, not far at all. And there are those French Canadian names in the community.
I knew some Loomises growing up too, actually. I knew a big family of Loomises. With all your research and the full writing process, how long did it take you to complete the book?
This book, probably about 2 years. It was percolating and I was thinking and I was reading and I was writing, and the actual writing took about 1.5 years. This one came pretty quickly. That isn't always the case for me. The first book I ever wrote, The Tea Rose, took 10 years. I was trying to figure out how to write a novel. I, had no money after I graduated for grad school or no time for, writers groups. So I would just write in the morning before I went to work, and I would write on weekends, and I was trying to figure it all out. And That one took a while. That was the tea rose.
So somebody asked about the movie. What is the name of the movie based on your book?
The name of the movie, there isn't a name of the movie based on my book.
Okay.
A Northern Light has not been optioned for film. Other books of mine have. The Tea Rose series, the Tea Rose, the Winter Rose, and the Wild Rose have been optioned for miniseries, and Stepsister and Poison have been optioned for feature films. There is an older movie based on the murder case. I think it's called A Place in the Sun. Am I right about that? With Shelley Winters, Elizabeth Taylor, and Montgomery Clift.
Okay. This is a question about the conviction. Somebody said, I believe the murder conviction was the first in the country based on circumstantial evidence. Am I right about that? That's what the
I
person
don't
asked.
know. I don't know if it was
Okay.
the first. I'm just, not a legal scholar, unfortunately. I know that they did base it on circumstantial evidence, but I don't know if it was the first case.
Okay. All right. I live the person who asked the question says I live in Auburn, New York. I've heard that he is buried there in an unmarked grave.
I believe he is, yes.
Okay. Is Big Moose as remote now as it was then?
No, it's not as remote, but it's still, as Adirondack lakes go, it's not one of the busiest, and you can still paddle around in there in your kayak or canoe and see no people, no houses, and hear that stillness. It's one of my favorite places on the planet. It is, to me, one of the most beautiful places and one of the most tragic.
Where did the title A Northern Light come from?
I think it came really from, being this story set in the North, and this sort of idea of light, dawning light, enlightenment, the light of education, kind of suggested by Mattie herself.
Okay. So here's a somebody who has a personal connection to one of the places in this story. South Otselic is my hometown. My grandmother was a neighbor of Grace Brown, and she went to her funeral. Did you ever
Oh,
visit the town?
I did. Yes, I have visited the town and Grace's gravesite.
Oh, wow. That must have been something.
Yes, it was.
That must have been very emotional, I can imagine. Do you know whom it was that alerted the people that Grace was missing, and how long did it take for the people to recognize that how long did it take for people to kind of know that she was missing?
As I recall, it was sort of people in the hotel because Chester and Grace had gone, even though they weren't staying in the hotel, they had gone to the hotel to sort of rent a boat and go out on the water. And I think the boat didn't come back, and they didn't come back. And this is a great camp, but it's not sort of, a White Lotus Four Seasons, which is enormous. It's
Hmm.
contained, it's somewhat small. You're going to know if your boat didn't come back. Where did this couple go? Why haven't they come back? So, it was people around the hotel, and then kind of figuring out what had happened and getting searchers to go out on the Zilpha to try to look for them.
Hmm. Hmm. What's next for you in your writing? What are you working on?
Oh my gosh, a few things. I'm working on a new middle grade series for HarperCollins called Twix, which is about a little rat with anxiety who lives in New York City,
Oh,
who
no.
adores his older brother, who is a race car driver, as rats are in New York. And when his brother disappears, young Twix has to marshal all his courage and all his bravery and go out and find him. So that's coming soon. That's for very young readers, about 8 to 12. Another Rose Petals is in the works, which are sort of just tiny continuation stories of my big series. Those books tend to range to about 500 or 700 pages. So it's not so easy to knock one of those out every year. So I'm doing smaller books. One is called, oh my gosh, Molly's Letter, Where Roses Fall, and the third one is in the works. And as I mentioned, also working on an idea for this new historical, but that's going to take a little while.
Okay. Okay. And this person asks, which do you enjoy more, writing young adult or adult books?
All of it. I enjoy all of it. I love writing. It's nice to sort of turn between one audience and one project to another. If something is stuck and not going well, it's nice to be able to turn away and pull up another manuscript and try and get my confidence back by having, a successful writing day with that manuscript. But I feel, immensely privileged to be doing the job that I'm doing. And it's just all good. Writing for kids, writing for teens, writing for grown-ups.
I'm going to ask a question actually.
Oh,
When the book comes to you, kind of when the idea comes to you, how do you tell if it's for? I mean, The rat with the
Mm.
motorcycle with the race car driver, that I mean, that one's kind of, but how do you tell if, especially with something like this, that is it, if it's young adult or adult? How do you tell what the audience is for the
It's
stories as they
kind of
come to you?
thinking, who do I want to talk to? Who does the character want to talk to? And with a Northern Light, it was, I so wanted to grab teen readers, and I so wanted them to, take Mattie into their hearts and understand that it's up to you to determine your own path. Because when you're 15, 16, 17, the whole world is out there telling you who to be and how to be and what to do. And it's so hard to hear your own voice, to still all this chatter and listen to that voice deep inside and figure out who you are and what path you want to take. So I think it's really the message, that determines to me who my audience is going to be, the message and what that character wants to tell the reader.
That's interesting. Thank you. This is another book kind of about the writing process a little bit. Somebody asks to describe the room you are sitting in, and is it a special place for writing?
It is very special. I don't know if I can turn my camera around. Maybe I can a little bit, but it is the top of a stone carriage house that's about 110 years old. Was built as my main house was by Italian stonemason around the time of, I think, the end of World War One. And it just feels very safe, very secure, full of light, very warm, and a very nice place to write.
That's great. That's great. Do you know if there are any relatives of Grace's that still live in town where she was from? And did
I
you
know
meet any
there are
any
still,
relatives?
sorry, I believe there are still relatives. I don't know where they live. I don't know if they're still in her town.
Do you miss Mattie?
Very much. I do. I do miss her. I miss Weaver. I miss that whole world. They leave you. They're like your paper children, you have them for a short time and then they go off in the world and they
I
belong
like
to
that, your
others.
paper children. What was the side story of Miss Wilcox based on a real character?
A little bit. She in high school, I had a wonderful English teacher, Marilyn Grummett. I grew up partly in Rye, New York. I went to Rye High School, which is a suburb of New York City. And Miss Grummett would travel from, she lived in the city and she would travel to Rye to teach us. And we just built this whole story about this glamorous, rebel life that lived in the city. And she was a very smart woman, very, very talented teacher, and had, I don't want to say an edge, but she had, she could be sarcastic and she could be funny. And so I imbued a lot of Miss Wilcox with Miss Grummett.
I like that. Um, do you have the same literary agent you began with, or did
I
you ever change agents?
I do. I have two men who I consider to be the most wonderful literary agents in the world. For my adult work, I have Simon Lipscar at Writer's House. We've been together since I started my career. I owe my career to Simon. And Steve Malk represents my children's work. He's also in Writer's House, but out in San Diego, and I owe my career to him as well. They are agents, they are confidants, they are friends. They're with me in the foxhole. They're with me when things are bad. They're with me when things are good. They're just amazing. The two of them. I'm immensely grateful to both of them. I have my career because of both of them.
Wonderful. That's great. This is an interesting question. Why have the Tea Rose characters stayed with you while Mattie disappeared?
That is a good question. Maybe because Mattie just so firmly was, on that platform and then left. I don't know. That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for it. Maybe because I kind of know a little more what happened to the T Rose characters, and I myself don't know what happened to Mattie. It's a good question. I can't quite answer it.
Mm, that is a good question. That is a good question. Let's see. Are there any books that you are, this is kind of, I'm trying to put together a couple of questions here. Are
Okay.
there any books that you wanted to write, but then something came up and it didn't happen the way you wanted it to?
Yes, there are ideas I've had for books that are perking, and I go back and look at them and I think, underdeveloped, or you'll happen, but you won't happen now. It kind of has to get in the
Mhm.
queue sort of thing.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
yeah, I hope I live long enough to write out all the ideas I have, fingers crossed. But I think they maybe come to you when you're ready for them.
Okay. So you bring to our attention the many courageous women who are who had a presence in the Adirondacks. How can we amplify those stories in loud voices and small? How can we help?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I think we're doing it right now. We're on the Zoom. We're talking about it. Librarians, have the book and they give it to their patrons. Teachers teach the book. Um, my readers talk about the books. I think that's one way of doing it. Word of mouth. We readers.
Nice.
I'm not only a writer. I'm a reader. I talk about books all the time with the joy and enthusiasm and nerdy passion of a reader. And that word of mouth goes far. It really does. We all have that power as readers.
Yes, yes, we do. That's one of the best things about being a librarian is getting other people and to like the books that
Excited.
you've read and to amplify the voices of great authors. So we have time for one more question. Um, then let's see. Let's see. One more question. Oh, here we go. What what are you reading now, or what book have you read recently that you really loved?
Oh, let's see. I'm reading a lot just because I don't understand it about AI and social media. I just finished Ann Tyler's 3 Days in June, which was adorable. It was a wonderful book. It was very surprising. I don't want to give too much away. It was kind of a romance, but not the people in the book that you thought would be in the romance. It's lovely. It's only about 160 pages. It's very, very sweet. Highly recommend that one. Gosh, what else do I have? The minute somebody asks me this question all the time, my head goes just blank, and it's like,
Me
book. I've
too.
never even read a book. A lot of my favorites that I read are on social media. I do posts on them, I review them, and I also, for some weird reason, feel compelled to show my latest vintage clothing find right after I give my book review. So you get two for the price of one on social media, my book reviews.
I love it. I love it.
Oh,
Well,
I'm
thank you.
reading one on the Vikings. Rebecca, maybe you know it. It's a new one that came out. It just came out on Vikings. There's a woman author. It's the something and the something. That's not going to help anybody, but it's so
Oh,
good. It's one of these history
okay.
books that no matter what period of history you love, this author brings you so deeply into it. She's such a philosopher as well as a Viking historian. That one I can't put down. And I read a good one on Cicero, of course, no title, but it's new. It's probably the newest book out on Cicero and the Romans. And this author also brings the Romans alive as if they're your neighbors with all their little squabbles and their one-upping. And my house is bigger than his house, and my mosaic wall is so much better than yours. And it's wonderful. If somebody wants to email me afterwards when my brain comes back, I'm sure I'll have those titles.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. I'm Cheryl Bronstein. I am the Director of Interpretation at the Adirondack Experience. And Jennifer, this has been absolutely delightful. I also want to thank Rebecca and everybody at the Albany Public Library for this fabulous collaboration. This is the last in this season's series with Albany Public Library. But both the library and the museum have wonderful projects coming up. The museum itself opens up for our 2025 season on May 23rd. So you can see a lot of those places that Jennifer mentioned this evening. We hope to see you in the Adirondacks or at the library. And we hope you join us next year as our Zoom collaboration continues. I do want to give a quick shout out. We heard from a school tonight who joined. People from SUNY Mooresville are reading the book right now. And so they tuned in. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to all of you. And again, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Rebecca. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.